Rancher, do you just want something from me like everyone else? The Apache widow demanded. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. Clara Yazzie stood at the edge of her small homestead, watching the dry wind ripple through the sparse grass and tumbleweed. Her hands rested on the wooden fence she had built herself, the rough wood pressing into her palms. Since her husband's death, the ranch had been her responsibility alone, and every day brought a new struggle. She had learned to survive on her own, to protect the land and the livestock, and to trust no one. Outsiders, she knew, always had motives. They were never there just to help. Clara's eyes narrowed as she noticed a figure approaching from the distant dirt road. The man rode a horse, the dust rising behind him in a faint cloud. He was not the usual kind of visitor, no traveling salesman or neighbor passing through, but there was something about the way he carried himself. He sat tall in the saddle, calm, his hat pulled low over his eyes. She watched him silently, unsure of what to expect. When he arrived at the gate, he dismounted slowly, giving Clara space. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady, carrying a soft tone that seemed to belong more to the mountains than the desert plains. "I'm Tom Sullivan. I heard you might need some help with your ranch." Clara's heart tightened. Her grip on the fence stiffened. She had heard this kind of line countless times before. "Help?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "Or do you just want something from me like everyone else?" The words came out before she could stop them, heavy with suspicion and the weight of past betrayals. Tom froze for a moment, not offended, but seemingly unshaken. "I understand why you would think that," he said. "People have not always been fair to you, but I don't want anything but to offer my help." "I am not here to take." Clara studied him carefully. His clothes were plain, worn, but clean. His hands were calloused, showing years of work, not wealth or greed. Still, she did not trust easily. Too many times she had seen her husband's friends, or strangers, appear under the guise of kindness, only to leave with what they wanted, leaving her with nothing. Her eyes narrowed again, her mind filled with memories of broken promises and unfair deals. "You'll have to prove that," she said finally, the words cautious but firm. "I do not let anyone in my life easily. Especially now." Tom nodded slowly. "I wouldn't expect you to. I can start by helping with the fences. The wind must have damaged a few sections. It will give you time to see if I am trustworthy." Clara hesitated. The wind had indeed torn down part of the fencing near the northern pasture, letting some of the smaller livestock wander freely. She had been planning to repair it herself, but the work would take hours in the blistering sun. Tom's offer was practical, and she had no choice but to accept, though she made sure to keep her eyes on him every moment. They worked in silence at first, the sound of hammering and the occasional clink of metal filling the air. But Clara watched as Tom measured and tightened each post, careful not to overstep, careful to respect her space. He asked no personal questions, made no demands, and did not try to impress her with stories of his own success. There was a steady rhythm to his work, a quiet patience that Clara did not expect. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Clara felt a strange mix of irritation and curiosity. She did not want to feel gratitude toward an outsider, but the truth was undeniable. The fence looked stronger than it had in months. Still, she remained guarded. When they took a break, sitting on a fallen log, Tom offered her water from his canteen. Clara accepted, her fingers brushing against his hand briefly. She pulled away quickly, uncomfortable with the small intimacy, and reminded herself not to trust too easily. I see why your husband held this land so dearly, Tom said quietly, looking around. It is not easy, but it is yours. That counts for a lot. Clara's eyes flicked toward him. There was no hidden meaning in his words, only observation. She appreciated the sentiment, but it did little to soften the walls she had built around herself. It is mine, she said simply, and I intend to keep it that way. For the next few hours, they continued working, the sun finally dipping below the horizon. The air turned cooler, and the desert night began to settle in, with the faint sounds of distant coyotes and the rustle of nocturnal animals. Clara felt a pang of loneliness, realizing how much she had relied on herself for everything. She had grown used to the silence and the solitude, and it was difficult to imagine anyone else being part of her life, even someone who seemed honest. As they finished repairing the last section of fence, Tom gathered his tools. I will head back to my ranch now, he said. Tomorrow I can help with the water troughs if you like. No pressure, only if you want. Clara nodded, her voice still cautious. I will think about it. No promises. He smiled faintly, not offended. That's all I ask. I will not force my way in. When he rode off down the dusty road, Clara stayed at the gate for a long time, watching the fading figure. Her mind raced with questions she had not expected to have. Could a man like this exist, who truly came without an ulterior motive? Or was this another test, another disappointment, waiting for her? She shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts. She had learned to survive, and survival meant keeping others at a distance. That night, Clara sat by the fire, the small cabin warm against the desert chill. She reflected on the day, the sound of the wind through the gaps in the roof, mingling with the crackle of the fire. Her husband's memory lingered, a quiet presence that reminded her of the responsibilities she carried and the trust she had lost over the years. Yet, in the back of her mind, a small question persisted. What if someone could help without expecting anything in return? She pushed the thought away, telling herself she could not afford to hope. Trust was fragile, easily broken, and the desert had taught her that nothing worth having came without risk. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the work that never ended. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, sitting by the fire, thinking about the unexpected visitor and the strange possibility of something genuine. As sleep crept in, Clara felt a mixture of caution and curiosity. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether Tom Sullivan would return, or if this was the last time she would see him. But for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to imagine that not everyone who came to her land wanted to take something away. Some might come simply to offer help, and perhaps, in time, she could learn to see that. Outside, the desert night stretched on endlessly, stars blinking down like distant eyes watching over the land. Clara closed her eyes, holding on to the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could be trusted. Someone who would see her not as a widow to be taken advantage of, but as a woman who had earned every inch of her life through hard work, resilience, and strength. And somewhere in the distance, Tom Sullivan rode home, unaware that his simple offer of help had begun to stir a cautious trust in the heart of a woman who had long ago learned to rely only on herself. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the desert, casting a soft light over Clara Yazzy's ranch. The air was cool, and the faint scent of sagebrush floated across the land. Clara moved among her livestock, checking the fences and counting the goats. The northern fence, the one Tom had helped repair, stood firm, its posts straight and strong. She could not help but notice how much easier her morning chores had become, though she refused to admit it out loud. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves approached again, Clara looked up and saw Tom Sullivan riding slowly along the dirt road, a small pack strapped to his saddle. He waved, keeping a polite distance as he neared. "Good morning," he called. "I thought I might help with the water troughs today. The summer heat is coming, and it's important the animals have enough water." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She had learned not to depend on anyone, yet something in his voice made her hesitate. She finally nodded. "All right," she said, her tone cautious. "But I'll be watching. I do not want surprises." Tom nodded, his expression calm and patient.
Of course. That is fair.
They worked together near the troughs, Tom hauling buckets of water while Clara checked the plumbing and cleaned the wooden supports. Their movements were careful, measured, each respecting the other's space. Clara noticed that he did not rush, did not try to dominate the work, and did not speak unless necessary. There was a quietness about him, a steadiness that contrasted with the chaos that had filled her life in the months after her husband's death. As the sun climbed higher, they paused in the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow and looked at Tom. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked, the question finally escaping her lips. "Everyone else who comes here wants something. I want to know what you want." Tom looked at her, meeting her eyes with sincerity.
"Nothing," he said simply. "I am not here for anything."
"I help because I can, and because the work needs to be done. You have lived here alone and have done well. I can make it easier, that is all." Clara studied him carefully. There was no hesitation in his voice, no hidden meaning. Still, she could not let herself trust so easily. "Words are easy," she said softly, "but they do not prove anything. Actions do." Tom nodded. "I understand. Then watch me. See if I follow through." The day passed slowly, with the sun burning overhead and the wind carrying dust across the land. Clara could not help noticing how precise Tom's work was. He repaired the troughs, ensuring that each held water correctly and would not leak. He fixed small problems she had ignored for weeks, making life easier without asking for anything in return. While they worked, Clara allowed herself to observe him more closely. Tom was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his words carried thought and honesty. He asked questions about the animals, about her routines, and about the land, not to pry into her personal life, but to understand how best to help. Clara found herself answering, cautiously at first, then with slightly more ease. By mid-afternoon they had finished the troughs, and the animals drank freely from clean water. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Tom. For a moment, she felt a sense of relief, though she would not admit it aloud. "Thank you," she said quietly. Tom nodded, a small, respectful smile on his face.
"You don't have to thank me. The work needed doing."
"I am glad to help." Later that evening, Clara was surprised to see a few neighbors from the nearby settlement passing by her ranch. They paused to watch the two work together, whispering among themselves. Clara knew the gossip would travel quickly. A widow working with a rancher was unusual, and people would assume there was more than friendship. She felt a mix of irritation and pride. She had survived without relying on others, and yet, here she was, sharing her space with someone she had barely begun to trust. After the neighbors left, Clara and Tom sat by the small well near the house. The desert sky was deep blue, dotted with stars that glimmered like distant fireflies. Clara felt a quiet tension in the air. She did not want to let herself rely on anyone, yet she could not deny that having help made her life easier. "You work hard," she said finally. "More than most people I know." Tom shrugged slightly. "Life is easier when you do the work yourself, but sometimes it helps to share the burden. Clara looked away, focusing on the dark shapes of the hills in the distance.
I have learned to rely only on myself, she said quietly.
Trusting someone else is dangerous. It can lead to disappointment. I know, Tom replied gently, and you should be cautious. Trust is earned, not given. The honesty in his words struck Clara. He did not demand her trust, he did not push. He simply stated the truth as he saw it, giving her the choice to decide. For a moment, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not for romance, not for companionship, but for the rare possibility that someone could be dependable. The days that followed were a repetition of labor and cautious observation. Tom returned each morning, helping with chores, repairing small damages, and making life slightly easier. Clara remained vigilant, watching him carefully, noting every action, every word, searching for any sign of hidden motives. She found none. One morning, as they worked repairing the fence along the western pasture, Clara spoke quietly. "My husband used to do this with me," she said, almost to herself. "He would never leave the work half done." Tom listened silently. "Then you have learned well," he said.
It shows in how strong this ranch is.
Clara felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. The memories of her husband were never far, and sometimes they felt like a weight on her heart. Yet, seeing Tom work with care, she felt a small sense of comfort. He was not replacing her husband, nor did he try to. He simply helped, respecting the work and the land. One afternoon, a sudden windstorm blew across the plains, kicking up dust and making the work difficult. Clara struggled with the fence posts as the wind tore at her hat and whipped her skirt. Tom quickly came to her side, holding a post steady and helping her secure it. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but with a hint of recognition. He was not just helping because he wanted something. He was helping because it needed to be done. By the time the storm passed, the fence was secure, and Clara felt a quiet respect for the man who had come into her life. She still did not trust easily, but she could no longer deny that his actions matched his words. That evening, as they rested by the fire in the small cabin, Clara allowed herself a small moment of reflection. She did not speak much, but she observed Tom quietly, noticing how he cleaned his tools, how he respected her space, and how he never asked for more than she was willing to give. She realized that trust was not built in a day, and she still had walls around her heart. But she also realized that perhaps it could be built, slowly, with patience and consistency. Tom, sitting across from her, seemed to understand her silence. He did not push, did not pry, and did not try to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. There was a calmness to him, a steady presence that contrasted with the uncertainty and loneliness Clara had lived with for so long. As night fell, Clara went to bed with a mind full of thoughts. She thought about her husband, the life they had shared, and the work that still needed to be done. She thought about the people who had come and gone in her life, leaving only memories and lessons. And she thought about Tom Sullivan, a man who had arrived with nothing but help, whose actions spoke louder than words. For the first time in months, she felt a small spark of something she had thought impossible: cautious optimism. Perhaps not everyone wanted to take something from her. Perhaps, in the vast, harsh desert, there were still people who could be trusted, people who could help without expecting anything in return. And somewhere on the road back to his ranch, Tom rode slowly, unaware that his simple actions had begun to break through the walls of a woman who had learned to rely only on herself. He did not know if she would ever fully trust him, but he had done what he came to do: offer help, without demand, without expectation, simply because it was needed. The desert night stretched on, stars twinkling above, and Clara closed her eyes, holding on to the quiet thought that maybe, slowly, trust could grow. Not fast, not easily, but steadily, with time and patience. And that, she realized, was a rare and precious thing indeed. The days grew warmer as spring moved toward summer, and Clara Yazzy's ranch thrived under her careful watch. The livestock were healthy, the fences repaired, and the small crops she had planted in the spring were beginning to show promise. Tom Sullivan continued to come each morning, helping without asking for anything, always respectful of Clara's space and decisions. Still, Clara's mind was not fully at ease. She had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, and the desert had taught her that danger often arrived disguised as help. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the dirt road, raising a small cloud of dust. Clara's heart tightened. She recognized the man immediately. It was one of her distant relatives from her Apache community. They had come to check on her after hearing about her husband's death and the unusual arrangement with the rancher. Clara felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Her family's presence was both comforting and troubling. "Clara," the man said as he dismounted, "we have heard you are accepting help from a stranger. We must ask, can he be trusted?" Clara's hands tightened on the fence post she had been repairing. "I am capable of managing my ranch," she said firmly.
I do not need lectures. Tom is only helping because it is needed.
"He asks for nothing." Her relative frowned.
You must be careful.
"Outsiders rarely help without purpose. Remember what has happened to others in our community." Clara shook her head, frustration rising. "I know my own mind. I know how to protect my home. I do not need warnings from people who have never lived in this desert, never faced its trials." The relative's eyes lingered on Tom, who stood quietly nearby, cleaning his tools. There was a hint of suspicion in their gaze, but also something else: curiosity. Clara could see that they were trying to understand him, to determine if he was worthy of her trust. Tom spoke calmly, his voice even. "I respect her decisions. I do not ask for anything beyond what she allows. I am here only to help, nothing more." The relative studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will watch," they said. "But remember, Clara, not everyone can be trusted. Stay alert." After the visitors left, Clara felt a mixture of relief and unease. Her family's warnings reminded her that her life was still fragile, even with Tom's help. The desert could be unforgiving, and even the smallest mistake could have consequences. She could not allow herself to forget that, no matter how steady Tom seemed. Later that week, a crisis struck the ranch. One of the goats had gone missing, and Clara discovered a section of the northern fence damaged by the sudden spring winds. Panic rose in her chest. She had counted on the fences being strong, yet the desert had reminded her once again that nothing was certain. Tom was already by her side, assessing the damage. "We can fix this quickly," he said. "I will help you round up the animals." Clara's first instinct was to insist she could manage alone, but she realized the truth. She could not. The goat was missing, likely wandering into the scrub, and she needed help. She nodded, her jaw tight. "All right," she said, her voice firm but unwilling to show weakness. Together they searched the nearby hills, calling out and scanning the rocky terrain. Hours passed under the scorching sun, but they found the goat trapped in a small ravine, frightened and bleeding. Tom helped her lift the animal to safety, carefully checking for injuries. Clara could not help but notice how gentle he was, how patient, and how entirely focused on the task. He expected nothing in return. By the time they returned to the ranch, sweat coated their faces. and their clothes were streaked with dust. Clara felt a quiet sense of gratitude she refused to voice. Tom's actions spoke more than words ever could. She realized that helping her did not diminish his character. In fact, it revealed it. That evening, as they repaired the damaged fence together, Clara allowed herself to ask questions about Tom. She wanted to understand him better, not to pry, but to see if there was any hint of hidden motives. "Why do you live so far from the town?" she asked, her voice cautious. Tom paused, holding a post in place. "I wanted space. I needed to think. Life can be complicated in the settlements. People judge too quickly. Here the land is honest. It shows what is real and what is not." Clara considered his words. There was a quiet honesty to him, a transparency she had rarely seen in others. He spoke without boasting or complaining, without trying to impress. There was only the truth of his experience, laid out plainly. "You've had troubles," she said softly, almost as a statement, not a question. Tom nodded. "Yes. A failed marriage, financial struggles, loss, things that teach you how to survive, how to respect others, and how to work hard. That is why I came here, to offer help where it is needed." Clara studied him, her eyes searching for any trace of deceit. She found none. Slowly, she began to realize that not everyone came with selfish motives. Some people acted out of integrity, out of principle, or simply because they could make a difference. The days passed in a steady rhythm: work, repair, and quiet observation. Yet Clara's mind remained alert. She remembered her husband's words about the dangers of trusting too quickly and the necessity of caution in all dealings. Still, she noticed that her attitude toward Tom had begun to shift. She no longer watched him with sharp suspicion at every movement. Instead, she began to notice small details: how he remembered which animals needed the most attention, how he quietly fixed a leaking trough before she even saw it, how he respected her decisions without question. One afternoon, as they worked together planting new crops along the western edge of the ranch, Clara paused to rest. She looked at the horizon, the golden light casting long shadows across the land. "I have lived a long time alone," she said softly, "and I have learned that help can come at a cost. People often take more than they give." Tom nodded, understanding her caution. "Yes, I know. That is why I do not ask for anything. I only give what I can. And if that is not enough, I will leave. The choice is yours." Clara felt a quiet respect for the way he honored her boundaries. There was no pressure, no expectation. He simply offered his presence and his work, and nothing more. Slowly, she began to see that trust could be built with consistent action, with patience, and with honesty. That evening, a small incident tested her trust further. A neighboring rancher stopped by unexpectedly, curious about the unusual partnership between a widow and an outsider. He asked questions with a thinly veiled interest in acquiring land or livestock. Clara felt irritation rising, but she noticed how Tom handled the situation: politely, firmly, without confrontation, and without giving the man any reason to doubt her authority. After the visitor left, Clara allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "You handled that well," she said, her voice quiet. Tom smiled faintly. "You taught me how to respect your space. That is all I did." Clara realized that his presence had not only helped her with physical labor, but had also provided a sense of security she had not known she needed. She was still cautious, still wary of trusting completely, but she could not deny that life felt slightly easier with him nearby. That night, Clara sat by the fire, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. She thought about her husband, about the struggles she had endured alone, and about the lessons the desert had taught her. And she thought about Tom Sullivan, a man who had entered her life without demand, without pressure, and without expectation. For the first time, she considered that trust might be possible, not blindly, not quickly, but slowly, built through actions, consistency, and respect. She allowed herself a quiet hope, a recognition that perhaps not everyone sought to take advantage. Some people could act out of honesty, integrity, and genuine care. As sleep came, Clara felt a small sense of peace. The desert night was quiet. The stars scattered across the sky like diamonds, and the wind whispered through the sparse grass. She knew that challenges would continue, that trust was fragile, and that life in the desert remained unpredictable. But she also knew that she had begun to open a small door, a door through which the possibility of help and perhaps even companionship could enter. And somewhere down the road, Tom rode home, unaware of the growing trust he had earned. He did not know if Clara would ever fully accept him into her life, but he had done what he came to do: offer help patiently and respectfully, without expectation. In doing so, he had begun to show her that not all people came with selfish intent, and that sometimes, even in the harsh desert, trust could be found. The following weeks passed with a quiet rhythm, the desert days growing longer and warmer. Clara Yazzie continued her routines, checking on the livestock, tending the small crops, and repairing fences. Tom Sullivan arrived each morning, helping without complaint, always aware of Clara's boundaries and her careful rules. What was remarkable to Clara was that he never overstepped, never questioned her decisions, and never demanded recognition. His presence was consistent, dependable, and quietly comforting, though she refused to admit it aloud. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Clara noticed Tom already at work, tending to a broken water wheel that fed one of the troughs. The wheel had stopped turning during the night, and without it, the smaller animals would have little water. Clara's heart tightened. She had intended to fix it herself, but she had been delayed by other chores. "Good morning," she said cautiously, approaching him.
Oh?
"Good morning, Tom," replied, looking up briefly from his work. "I saw the wheel had stopped. I thought I could help." Clara hesitated. "You don't have to. I can manage." Tom shook his head gently. "I know, but I choose to." "You do enough already. There's no reason to make it harder than it needs to be." She studied him for a moment, taking in the steady focus in his eyes. There was no hint of obligation, no expectation of reward, only action, quietly offered. Clara found herself surprised by how much she relied on his help, and yet she was beginning to appreciate it in a way she had not expected. As the morning passed, Tom repaired the wheel with careful precision. Clara observed him silently, noticing how methodical and patient he was. Each movement was deliberate, each adjustment made with care. She realized that this was a man who respected work, who respected life, and most importantly, who respected her. By midday, the wheel turned again, feeding fresh water to the animals. Clara allowed herself a small smile, though she quickly covered it with a nod. "Thank you," she said softly. "You do not have to thank me," Tom replied. "I am glad to help." After the work was done, they took a moment to rest under the shade of the lone mesquite tree near the edge of the property. Clara watched the horizon, the hills painted in soft gold by the afternoon sun. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it a sense of calm that she had not felt in months. "You have done a lot for me already," she said quietly. "More than most people would." Tom shrugged. "I do what I can. That is all." Clara's thoughts drifted to her late husband. She remembered how he had handled the ranch, the care he had taken, the decisions he had made to protect the land and the animals. She had learned from him, but she had also felt the sharp edge of loneliness since his passing. Now she realized that Tom's presence had softened that loneliness slightly. Not that she depended on him emotionally, but simply that she felt less alone in her work. The days passed with similar routines: morning chores, midday rest, afternoon repairs, but a subtle change began to take place in Clara. She noticed Tom not just as a helper, but as a person. He spoke of small things, the seasons, the weather, the animals, but his words carried insight and patience. He shared bits of his life, carefully chosen, without ever imposing. One evening, as the sun sank below the hills, Clara invited Tom to sit with her by the fire. It was unusual for her to share the space so casually, but she felt the need for conversation, for connection that did not feel threatening. "I never asked," she began, hesitating slightly. "What brought you to this part of the desert? Why leave town and live so far from others?" Tom looked into the flames, the flickering light reflecting in his eyes. "I wanted quiet," he said, "a place where life is measured by effort, by honesty, by what you do with your own hands. In town, people are too quick to judge. Here, the land tells the truth. It shows you what matters." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand that. Life here is honest, even when it is hard." Tom smiled faintly. "Exactly. And hard work teaches respect. Respect for the land, for others, and for oneself." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Clara felt an unfamiliar sense of ease. She realized that her walls, built from years of caution and past pain, were beginning to feel less rigid, not entirely gone, but softer, more flexible. Over the next few days, Clara faced another challenge. One of her small fences near the eastern pasture had been damaged by a herd of cattle passing from a neighboring ranch. Clara felt her frustration rising. She had been careful, meticulous, yet even small setbacks could cause serious problems. Tom noticed her tension and approached quietly. "Do you want help?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but do not do it your way. Do it the way I want it done." Tom agreed without complaint. Together, they rebuilt the fence, working side by side. Clara gave directions, and Tom followed them precisely, never questioning, never offering an alternative unless asked. Through the physical labor, a sense of partnership began to form. It was not friendship in the casual sense, nor romance, but a recognition of mutual respect and shared purpose. One afternoon, a small fire broke out near the western edge of the ranch, sparked by a discarded ember from a passing traveler's campfire. Clara acted quickly, but the flames spread faster than she anticipated. Panic threatened to rise, but Tom remained calm. He grabbed a nearby bucket and helped her fight the fire, moving methodically to protect the crops and animals. By the time the fire was under control, both were covered in soot and sweat, exhausted but relieved. Clara looked at Tom with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "I could not have managed that alone," she admitted. Tom shook his head.
You would have managed. I only helped to make it safer.
That is all. Clara realized in that moment that she was beginning to trust him not just with labor, but with the safety of her home. It was a profound step for someone who had learned to depend on herself alone. That evening, as they rested by the fire, Clara spoke quietly. "I have spent so long protecting myself from others, I forgot what it feels like to let someone in, even just a little." Tom looked at her with understanding. "It is not easy. Trust takes time, patience, and consistency. I will not rush you." Clara felt a small warmth in her chest. a recognition that she could allow herself to accept help without fear. It was not weakness, it was strength. She could still control her land, make her own decisions, and lead her life. But she could do so with the knowledge that not everyone sought to take advantage. Some people acted with honesty and integrity, simply because it was right. Days turned into weeks, and the partnership between Clara and Tom deepened. They shared small meals together, talked quietly in the evenings, and worked tirelessly during the day. Clara began to notice the little things, how Tom remembered which animals needed attention, how he quietly repaired small problems before they became serious, and how he respected her leadership without questioning her authority. One night under a sky filled with stars, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about her late husband, about the struggles she had endured alone, and about the man who had entered her life without demand or expectation. She realized that life could still offer surprises, that not all people came with selfish motives, and that trust could grow slowly when earned through consistent action. As she drifted to sleep, Clara felt a quiet sense of hope. The desert remained harsh, the challenges unending, but she no longer faced them entirely alone. And somewhere in the distance, Tom sat by his own campfire, unaware of the small but meaningful impact he had made on her life. Through patience, honesty, and steady action, he had begun to break down the walls that loneliness and loss had built, showing her that trust, once thought impossible, could begin to grow. Spring slowly gave way to summer, and Clara Yazzy's ranch was thriving. The fences stood strong, the animals were healthy, and the small fields of crops promised a fruitful harvest. Life was not easy. Living in the desert never was. But Clara no longer felt entirely alone. Tom Sullivan continued to arrive each morning, helping with work around the ranch, his presence steady and dependable. Over time, Clara had begun to recognize that his intentions were genuine. He was not there to take, to judge, or to manipulate. He was there simply to help. One early morning, Clara stood by the corral, watching the sunrise over the distant hills. The golden light reflected off the dust on the ground, casting long shadows across the ranch. She noticed Tom already tending to the water troughs, his movements careful and precise. He had repaired them perfectly the day before, but he checked them again, ensuring that every animal had enough to drink. Clara felt a quiet appreciation for his consistency. It was not about gratitude. It was about recognizing reliability in a world where so much was uncertain. "Morning," she called softly, walking toward him. "Morning," he replied without looking up, focused on the task at hand. "The water levels are good. I made sure nothing is leaking." Clara nodded, satisfied. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of ease. She could trust the ranch to remain in order even while she took a moment to breathe. That trust had not come quickly. It had been earned through countless days of action, patience, and consistency. Later that morning, as they repaired a section of fence along the eastern pasture, Clara noticed the wind picking up. Dark clouds formed in the distance, the desert sky changing suddenly from bright blue to gray. She knew a storm was approaching. "Looks like we need to finish this quickly," she said, urgency creeping into her voice. Tom nodded. "We can do it together." "Don't worry." They worked swiftly, reinforcing the fence posts and tightening the wires. The first drops of rain fell as they finished the last section, and the sound of rain hitting the roof and dry ground was both soothing and urgent. Clara felt a strange mix of relief and pride. She had faced storms before, literal and metaphorical, but she no longer felt as vulnerable. With Tom beside her, work that once would have taken endless hours and energy was manageable. When the storm passed, they returned to the cabin, both tired but satisfied. Clara prepared a simple meal and they ate in comfortable silence, the smell of rain still lingering in the air. It was one of those rare moments when Clara allowed herself to simply observe the man who had become a part of her life. She thought about the weeks they had spent together, the labor they had shared, and the quiet trust that had developed between them. "You have been very patient with me," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I am not an easy person to trust." Tom smiled faintly. "I know. I expected that. Trust takes time, and I do not rush it. I only offer consistency, nothing more." Clara considered his words carefully. There was no flattery, no attempt to win her over with charm or exaggeration. He spoke plainly, honestly, and with respect. It was a quality she had rarely seen in others. Slowly, she began to understand that this kind of trust was rare and valuable. Over the following days, Clara found herself reflecting on her life and her choices. She had spent so long protecting herself from disappointment and betrayal that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to accept help. Yet Tom's presence had changed something within her. She was still independent, still capable of managing her ranch, but she had learned that there were people who could act out of genuine care. One afternoon, Clara noticed that one of the younger animals had wandered too close to the creek. She ran to prevent it from getting into trouble, but the ground was slippery after the recent rains. Tom was already beside her, steadying the goat and guiding it safely back to the pen. Clara realized in that moment how much she had come to rely on him, not just for labor, but for reassurance, for a sense of safety, for partnership. "You've taught me a lot about trust," she said quietly as they watched the animal settle back into the pen. Tom nodded.
"And you've shown me the strength of patience and independence."
"I have learned as much from you as you have from me." Clara felt a small warmth in her chest. She had learned to lead, to make decisions, to survive alone. Now she realized there was value in partnership, not dependency, but a shared effort, mutual respect, and understanding. The following week brought another challenge. A neighboring rancher arrived, seeking to purchase some land for expansion. Clara knew this man's reputation. He often tried to pressure widows and small landowners into selling. She met him at the fence line, her voice firm. "I am not interested," she said plainly. The man tried to argue, suggesting that she could not manage the ranch alone, that it would be easier to sell. Clara looked toward Tom, who stood silently behind her. His presence gave her strength, not because he would fight for her, but because she felt supported, knowing she was not entirely alone. "I manage this ranch myself," Clara said firmly, her eyes steady. "I have help when needed, but I make the decisions here. Now leave." The man hesitated for a moment, surprised by her firmness and the quiet support of Tom, then nodded and rode away. Clara watched him disappear over the horizon, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had defended her land, her choices, and her independence. And yet, she now realized that she did not have to face every challenge entirely alone. As the summer sun blazed high, Clara and Tom continued their work, side by side. They repaired fences, tended the animals, and prepared the crops for harvest. Over time, the quiet partnership had grown into something deeper, a bond built on respect, honesty, and consistent action. Clara began to see Tom not as an outsider, but as someone who truly understood the value of hard work and integrity. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara spoke softly. "I never thought I would trust someone like this. Not so quickly, not so fully. But you have shown me that trust is not about words. It is about actions." Tom nodded, looking into the flames. "Yes. Actions speak louder than words. I am here because I want to help, because it is right, and because I respect you and this land. Clara felt a quiet sense of relief. For so long she had feared betrayal, feared that anyone who came close would take something from her. Now she understood that it was possible for someone to come into her life without ulterior motives. Someone could offer help, respect her independence, and still act with honesty and integrity. The summer days continued, each filled with work, small victories, and quiet moments of reflection. Clara began to notice that her heart felt lighter. She could focus on the future, on growing her ranch, on protecting her land, without the constant fear of exploitation. She had learned that partnership did not mean weakness. It meant shared effort, mutual respect, and the ability to trust someone who had earned it. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the desert hills, Clara looked at Tom, standing beside her while they repaired a section of fence. She felt a quiet gratitude, not for favors or assistance, but for the integrity, patience, and consistency he had shown. He had entered her life without demand, without expectation, and had quietly earned her trust through his actions. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice sincere. Tom shook his head. "You do not need to thank me. The work needed to be done, and I was glad to help." Clara smiled faintly, realizing that the true gift was not the labor but the lesson he had brought. That trust, once thought impossible, could grow slowly through honesty, patience, and respect. As night fell, Clara sat by the fire. The stars scattered across the sky like tiny lanterns. She thought about the past, the loneliness, the loss, and the struggles she had faced alone, and about the present, where trust and partnership had quietly found a place in her life. She understood that life would always be challenging, that the desert remained unpredictable, but she no longer faced it entirely on her own. Somewhere down the road, Tom sat by his own fire, unaware of the deep impact his consistent actions had on Clara. He did not know that his presence had softened her fears, that his patience had begun to heal old wounds, or that his respect for her independence had created a bond stronger than words could describe. Clara closed her eyes, feeling a quiet sense of peace. The desert was still harsh, the work never-ending, but she had learned that trust, carefully earned, could grow even in the most unlikely places. She had found someone who would help without taking, who would act without expectation, and who would respect her independence while offering quiet support. For the first time in many months, Clara felt a sense of hope, not a naive hope, but a grounded understanding that life could still offer genuine connections, even in the midst of challenges and uncertainty. And that realization, she knew, was one of the most valuable lessons she had ever learned.